Okay, hello from Los Angeles. So a bit earlier in the day here than with you. I thought I'd this year finish up my series of lectures with talking about something that has long interested me, uh, which is the whole question of agglomeration economies and how these produce different kinds of clusters of economic activities. But since the pandemic, certainly across the United States, but I think much more broadly, there's been a lot of discussion about the emergence of remote working, the challenge that this and a bunch of other changes are going to make to the whole question of industrial districts and specialized industrial centers. And this has taken a particular form in California. So I thought I'd be a bit more parochial than I've been the last 2 years and focus on the two big cities in California, San Francisco and Los Angeles. And to talk a little bit about what are kind of emerging narratives here that are quite strong, particularly in the local press, but also amongst some academics in California too. And I call these the San Francisco and Los Angeles doom loop narratives, the idea that the pandemic has triggered a whole series of changes and we can expect a kind of hollowing out of these two large economies. And of course, this follows, and that's what my main theme is, the hype over the years that these were particularly unique centers for very specialized industries over time. And that somehow this then sends a message, just like California in the past sent a message about the future. This is a different kind of message, a much more dystopian one about what's likely to come next. So if Alex, we could move on from the title here. So this is more or less what my abstract says. But there are a bunch of other changes that have gone on that people tend to stick together in these narratives. So it's not just about remote working, as we'll see, but urban housing and commuting costs, the reorganization of these previously dominant sectors in these two cities, tech really in San Francisco and the film, movie, and TV business in Los Angeles, and the relative stagnation of some what were really very dynamic industries, and then growing income inequality as well. And so relatively poorer people really increasingly unable to afford to live in these large cities. So I want to then move on. Let's go to the next slide here to talk about these two cities. So Los Angeles and San Francisco, two of America's leading urban economies, and particularly the San Francisco Bay Area is the world's leading center for startups and new technologies, and the home of companies like Intel, Apple, Google, Twitter, and Uber. And Los Angeles, of course, has been the center of film, entertainment, and to a certain degree, pop culture for a long time. But when it comes to income, wages, and other key metrics for economic development, San Francisco has done far better than Los Angeles over the past several decades. I don't think there's any doubt about that. At least this was the case until COVID-19 came along, hence my title, The Other Long COVID. Now both cities are increasingly discussed in terms of urban doom loops that promise poorer futures on the part of both. Now, both of these cities have been subject to hype in the past on the part of many commentators, and also apocalyptic visions have also been part of the history of both, especially Los Angeles. Think of Mike Davis's City of Quartz or Ecology of Fear and so on. So what should we make of the current doom narratives, and what may they say about the future of other major large cities? That's really my purpose today. So could we move on to the next? Sorry about this. So here are just a few facts and figures with some photos. Here we have San Francisco, the city-county population of under 1 million, but the metro population, which includes Silicon Valley, Santa Clara, and San Mateo counties, 3.3 million people. So, quite substantial, but smaller than the next one, next slide. Well, this is a picture from the Financial Times, which had one of these doom loop stories in it, and this is the dystopian image of San Francisco in the future. So the next slide. LA, of course, considerably bigger. The city itself, around 3.7 million. The Los Angeles County, 9.5 million. Metro area, 12.5. The second largest metropolitan area in the United States after New York. Signature image here. But here we have the doom loop Los Angeles. You know, this is from the film The Day After Tomorrow, where the Hollywood sign here is more or less in a state of decay. Moving on. And then these visual signs of some of the problems these cities face, particularly San Francisco, reputation, you know, for homeless encampment, for lots of people high on drugs, you know, visual symbols of decline. This gets made a lot of in these doom loop narratives. Maybe the next one. And then in Los Angeles this last summer, we've had this long-standing strike of the actors and the writers. Writers have settled. The actors are still on strike over really the future of the business that they're in. It's not just about residuals, payments for, you know, showing shows over and over again, but it's also about the future of the whole business in the face of technological change like artificial intelligence and so on, but also the move from, you know, going to the movies to streaming and people watching things at home. This whole trend. So the next one. So, you know, in the past, we've thought of these cities as being cities of the future, and much has been written about the significance of agglomeration economies in relation to California. Think of the work of my colleagues, Alan Scott and Michael Storper. And much of this points to the importance of industry-specific synergies and the services that arise around specialized clusters. And much recent writing has been about the relative resilience of cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles in the face of macroeconomic headwinds, but increasing diseconomies of scale in the sectors in which the two cities have recently specialized, tech in the first and film and TV in the second. And their relative decline compared to other US metro areas in recent years, even before the pandemic. So Michael, for example, co-edited this book, The Rise and Fall of Urban Economies, Lessons from San Francisco and Los Angeles in 2015. So the story here isn't completely new. But over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a revival of a different literature in a much more apocalyptic mode, not so much the dark side portrayed so brilliantly by Mike Davis on Los Angeles, but the militantly anti-urban diatribes of people like Joel Kotkin and others using the difficulties faced by the cities during the pandemic to portray the cities as literally doomed. The doom narratives take a number of forms, and that's really what I want to focus on here today. So if we could move on here. So the doom narratives. The narratives tend to pick out one or more of 8 themes as the basis for their stories about the two cities, with San Francisco tending to receive the major attention, only because, as Michael has pointed out, Los Angeles has been declining relative to San Francisco in median incomes and other indicators for some years. The collapse of the military, industrial, and aerospace industries in Southern California from the 1980s to the early 2000s is a major part of that story. But San Francisco and the so-called magic of the tech industries located in and around that city has suddenly been replaced by a disaster scenario in which everything that bound the city together is now unraveling. And these are the 8 themes that I just want to go through very, very quickly. Population exit, the cost of living, job loss and recovery, remote work, empty commercial real estate, overall post-pandemic recovery, perhaps a question of over-specialization, particularly in the case of San Francisco, and then the role of California's government in this. These all figure in various narratives about the decline of these two cities. So I want to survey these and then suggest that the evidence for none of these separately or together suggests a sudden demise for returns to agglomeration, that somehow this is going to underpin one of the stories many of us have been telling for years about why things tend to concentrate in some places and not in others. But these cities are definitely going through a cyclical downturn, and that's, I think, very much part of the story. But the overhyping of the success of these cities in the past has perhaps led to a tendency now to overhype talk of decline and fall. So that's my major theme. So let's go through each of these themes very quickly. And you can see here, Los Angeles and San Francisco, after New York, are forecast to have the biggest population losses of any major metropolitan areas in the United States over the next 5 years. You can see here that New York is thought to will recover by 2027, whereas San Francisco and Los Angeles will not. Only Chicago of the other cities is in a similar bind. So let's keep moving through these. So leaving town, this is people moving out. These are this is a particular projection for the future population after this big dip in 2020, 2022. This is looking at it over the next 30, 40 years. And you can see here, the predictions are that it's going to stagnate rather than grow. Next one on. This is the second feature of many narratives. This is the cost of living. It's too expensive to live in these cities. And you can compare the median wage to an affordable, what's called an affordable studio wage, which means, an apartment literally that doesn't have a bedroom, but, where you sleep in the living room. And if you look at the rates of those and compare them to median wages here, you can see that there's quite a distribution. But LA and San Francisco are very much towards the top end, if not as high as New York, as you can see, which is the highest of these, of the ratio between median wage and affordable studio wage. So again, these cities are kind of pricing themselves out. It's hard for people to move in who have anything below the median wage. Okay, next one. During the pandemic, they also lost a lot more jobs than did many of the other cities. And have been slow to recover, particularly San Francisco, you can see here. It did recover a bit in 2022, but 2023 is seeing quite a big reversal. And here, these are divided up by the three major counties: San Francisco County, which is also the city, San Mateo, and Santa Clara counties. And across all of these, 2022, there was a bit of an anemic recovery in monthly change in employment, but in 2023 things have really made a turn for the worse. Moving on. And this is LA's picture. Again, quite a severe employment downturn during the COVID. As you can see here, up to really 24% of all jobs in the city lost in 2020, but and a bit of a slow recovery since then, and slower than statewide. So with the blue line here is for the whole of California, the red line here for Los Angeles. So nowhere back, still about 10% down as of March this year on early January 2019. So next one. And a lot of this has been put down to the explosion of remote working during the pandemic, and the rebound of smaller cities in the United States compared to larger ones like Los Angeles and San Francisco. And you can see here, Madison, Wisconsin, for example, here, a lot more. This is about traffic rebounding in smaller cities relative. This is trips made to central business districts relative to cities like New York and San Francisco here. So this doesn't have LA in it, but it does have San Francisco in it. And the idea is that more people are remaining remote working in the larger metropolitan areas and are less likely then to be commuting daily, particularly to downtown locations. So central business districts have hollowed out as a result of this process. So next one here. And other ways of measuring this, we're looking at like mobile phone traffic in downtown areas, which really took a big dip in 2020, really revived in 2022, but it's really stagnated since then. So mobile phone use downtown compared to 2019 here, you can see it's Miami went up the highest to about 80% in 2021, but that's since leveled out. Los Angeles and particularly San Francisco, you can see here, real reduction way down over what it was in 2019. So a lot more people, a lot fewer people walking around downtown in San Francisco in 2023 with their cell phones, mobile phones, than was the case in 2019. So again, these are indirect measures of looking at the relative decline of people working downtown. Next slide. And it's particularly the tech sectors, information, IT, and so on, of course, which is what San Francisco specialized in, that have seen the largest use of remote working by industrial sector. You can see here it's distributed quite unevenly. But professional business services, generally financial activities, far more remote working there, which then affects a city like San Francisco much more than it might many others that are based around manufacturing or retail or transportation and warehousing, just to use those examples. Next one. and quite convincing arguments have been made that a lot of this has to do with big city dwellers are less willing and less able to pay to be close to the center because the house prices are so high. So many of the poorer workers live further out, and even more affluent ones during the pandemic moved sometimes out of state, even in California, to places with lower tax rates and so on, like Idaho and Texas and what have you. And it's been in bigger cities that there's been the biggest decline in commuting since the pandemic. So this is, again, a measure of I think a really substantive shift here. People often in Los Angeles spending two or more hours a day commuting, typically in the past. If now people are able to work from home, then that's a huge advantage. It also may, in fact, lead to increased productivity relative to the past. So there are pros and cons here to remote working that don't necessarily lead to conclusions about complete collapse or economic doom. Okay, next one. Both San Francisco and LA then overall have been slow to move back into offices. So remote work here is still much more pervasive than it is in certain other parts of the country. See, Austin, Texas here is the black line at the top. Even by last summer, quite a big increase. But Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco much lower rates. Again, reflecting the bigger cities having the slower rates of movement back into office space. Next slide. And this again shows the net migration of remote workers leaving town during the pandemic. San Francisco and San Jose in the Bay Area being way up at the top of the list here, and then New York and Los Angeles. So again, the bigger cities having much higher shares of all workers moving to remote. And the expensive metros lost far more than they gained. You can see here quite a shift in the patterns here. But San Francisco and LA here very much up at the top of the list. Okay, next one. But again, it's interesting who left town or works from home by income group. And you can see here, higher earners became even more likely to work remotely than poorer workers did. This reflects, of course, the structure of employment, with poorer workers being more in, fast food, restaurants, personal services and so on, which can't be done remotely or can only be done remotely in more limited ways. And the pandemic really did show a huge shift here. This was pre-pandemic remote working at the bottom here by income percentile across the bottom. And then during the pandemic, a huge increase, particularly at higher income percentiles here, which are on the right side of the graph here. So again, it's been selective. So it isn't just a question of avoiding expensive housing, but also people moving often away from the cities entirely. And this is particularly characteristic of San Francisco and Los Angeles. So next one. And this is the fifth part of many of these narratives, is empty real estate. As a result of increased remote working, office vacancies have increased enormously. This is a very complex graph here. I won't say very much about it, but the bottom 10 performers, that's the ones with the highest vacancy rates, have tended to be cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. San Francisco is the bottom, the one at the bottom here with the biggest increase in office vacancies of any large city during and since the end, the official end anyway, of the pandemic. And so it's got really takes the booby prize, if you like, in terms of office vacancies. Next one. And here we have California Street in San Francisco. This is ground zero now for empty commercial buildings with mortgages due. So, you know, many of these buildings have, you know, like 50 to 70% vacancy rates, and their mortgages are due, you know, for the firms that own them. And yet, of course, the leasing rates are so low that they can't possibly, they have to renegotiate their mortgages, but now they have to renegotiate mortgages in a much more higher interest rate environment than was the case 5 or 10 years ago when they originally bought the mortgages on many of these properties. So this is another potential part of the doom loop here, particularly in San Francisco. Okay, next one. And this is a nationwide problem across all metro areas in the U.S. Chicago, in fact, has a serious problem. Houston, even, which is thought of as a much more dynamic city at the moment, also has a problem. But nevertheless, it's much more serious in San Francisco and LA. You can see them; they're high at the end here than it is in many other metro areas. Next graph. So the overall post-pandemic recovery across then, in terms of a kind of an index of job recovery, population recovery, and so on, you can see here that many cities have had a much happier recovery than have San Francisco and LA, which are down towards the bottom here. San Jose and San Francisco are separated out here, but LA is in between them. And then places like Austin, Dallas, Denver, Tampa, and so on are at the other end, where there's been a much more stronger recovery from the pandemic. The next graph. Well, some people put this down to this overall story here, to over-specialization, and particularly in San Francisco, that the tech sector has grown. It's become a much more important source of both private sector payroll and the number of private sector jobs here. These are the two indicators here. And it did through the noughts and into the teens here. But in many ways now what we see is a confluence between the effects of the pandemic and in a way the beginning of the stagnation of the tech sector. The problem with the banks, for example, that service the tech sector, you're probably all aware of the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and what have you, that the connections between venture capital and startups and so on is eroded in the Silicon Valley and San Francisco areas compared to other parts of the United States. So these are all seen as indicating some kind of trend away from kind of specialization that the cities relied on. Next slide, please. So there's increased competition then, particularly in the tech sector, from other centers like Austin and Atlanta. I just mentioned Austin. And these other cities are also attracting increased foreign direct investment as it declines in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And both of these cities have been affected by US-China relations. Chinese investors were major investors in Los Angeles real estate and in the tech sector and real estate in San Francisco. And the deteriorating relations between the US and China meant that Chinese investment has really gone off a cliff over the last 2 or 3 years in both of these major cities. So that's another factor here in their relative decline. Next slide. As in fact the two other cities in the United States have kind of picked up the slack, not so much with Chinese investment from other parts of the world. At the same time, Hollywood, as a symbol, is no longer just in Los Angeles. And the studio model around which the movie business especially was based is really dying out. It's collapsing. And you can see here, this is the measure of film and TV industry employees. Los Angeles County is still the most important center for film and TV production in the United States, but the rest of the US has grown enormously. particularly states like Georgia, Louisiana have picked up a lot of movie and TV production in recent years. Next slide. And then finally, the final thing is the state tax and regulatory policies, which particularly some conservative or right-wing commentators focus on. You know, California is a relatively high tax, high service state compared to many other American states. And so increasingly, particularly high-end earners, can do better by moving to Nevada, which has no state income tax, or Florida, which has no state income tax, and so on, or other states where tax rates are much lower. And so they, some commentators draw attention to the fact that the number of startups, the number of business HQs in both Los Angeles and San Francisco has collapsed in recent years. These are data here covering a period between 2018 and 2021. The problem with these data that they don't talk about new arrivals of startups. They just are looking at who's leaving, which is of course a bit problematic on the part of these authors here. But nevertheless, the picture, the balance anyway, even if we included that here, the balance would suggest an out-migration of business HQs from big centers in California, particularly LA and San Francisco, because of the regulatory policies, which are relatively tight compared to many other US states, and state tax policies, which are seen particularly as affecting high-income earners. Okay, next slide. Well, what does all this come down to? And I just want to focus briefly on a number of these things. Well, you know, a lot of this stuff is exaggerated. You can put all of these 8 things together and you can create a really a sense of complete and utter doom. But it's still clear, I mean, from lots of studies and also from the relative recovery of some office jobs and so on, even in San Francisco at the moment, that proximity still matters, for job performance. And quite a lot of employers in particular are encouraging workers to, even if they're working hybrid, to come in at least 3 or 4 days a week. Increasingly, it's a 3-day week in many of these office settings. But and partly this is down to having to have some kind of face-to-face interaction, which matters in terms of particularly in innovative and creative industries. And remote work has merits, of course, for all kinds of reasons. But nevertheless, there's still this kind of pressure for people to work in groups as teams and so on. It's a bunch of, particularly the tech industries are very much team-oriented. Firms still need services in place. The firm headquarters itself, has a kind of clustering activity. Firms still learn and, of course, poach from one another. So being near to other businesses that are doing the same thing as you still matters enormously. The problems that these cities have had, like crime and homelessness, are in fact much less serious than alleged in terms of everyday life. Crime rates in San Francisco, anybody remember the Dirty Harry movies, from years ago? Make My Day and all that stuff. Crime rates are much lower than in the 1990s. And homeless are concentrated geographically in some neighborhoods. There are large areas of Los Angeles and even San Francisco where you don't notice. There are clusters in very particular places where it's evident. Commuting and house prices and rents are, oh dear. Sorry about that, my phone going off. Commuting and house price rents are the key diseconomies in San Francisco and Los Angeles. There's no doubt about that. They both affect low-income, predominantly recent immigrant groups more than the affluent. House prices are high because the affluent remain invested in residential real estate, and it's very hard to construct new low-income housing in and around the central cities in California. Downtown retail in San Francisco is in trouble, but not so retail in the suburbs. And Los Angeles never has had much downtown retail, if anyone has ever been here. And elsewhere, it seems pretty healthy. Online shopping has not replaced in-person for large segments of the population. More than 80% of purchases in the US are still in person. So again, that can be really exaggerated. Sectors in which they specialized, tech in San Francisco, films and TV in LA, are finding niches elsewhere. There's no doubt about that. And foreign direct investment is rising at a much more rapid rate in other cities. That's for sure. And a lot of this is about decline in Chinese investment in LA and San Francisco. Both cities then faced similar dilemmas, though, in the past. San Francisco used to be a major banking, finance, and trans-Pacific trading center. And Los Angeles was a major center for the military-industrial complex during the Cold War, and managed to move past that. California is becoming less attractive, particularly to high earners and business owners, because of a relatively high state income tax and corporate taxes, and more stringent regulatory and legal frameworks than states such as Texas. But the other side of this, or the downside of this, of course, is that these are also very low service states with poor public services. One could argue really inadequate provision of public goods. I think it's clear that remote working is here to stay, but not just in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and probably more in the end, for routine and less for creative jobs. And what I really want to end on is that I think what the danger here is of interpreting what is cyclical change as structural change. Let's finish up now here. So what we have here, of course, these are cycles that cities go through. We've been there before. This is San Francisco's unemployment rate, 1990 to 2022. So we're going through one of these cycles again. And obviously there are structural factors that I've drawn attention to, particularly high cost of housing, commuting costs, the availability now of remote working in the way it wasn't in the past. All of these things may lead to increased job loss in these kinds of cities, but nevertheless not in this kind of apocalyptic terms. Let's look at the last one, which is the next. This is the LA case, which has been much more muted historically, much less dynamic economy in some ways than that of San Francisco, interestingly. And now recovering relatively slowly, of course, from the pandemic. But again, I think all of these, what this points to is a cyclical rather than a structural change. Let's finish up now. Next slide. So maybe the conclusion here is that the overhyping up of San Francisco and LA, which has gone on, particularly in fields like geography and regional studies, over the last 40 or 50 years, now is leading to an overhyping down, a tendency to exaggerate the degree to which things are changing. But California's long been portrayed in American folk culture as the land of promise in the future. This has changed considerably in American political discourse in recent years. But this imagery is rubbed off on San Francisco and Los Angeles. And their recent troubles then are viewed as symptomatic of the death of this dream. The California dream is dying. And currently, particularly on the US political right, with its suspicion of foreign immigration, Hollywood, and so-called globalist elites, people, making movies, there's almost a glee in latching on to the doom narratives, particularly those associated with decrying the state government. There is a more widespread tendency to overhype remote work, I think, and the impact of state policies. The next few years, of course, will tell in how much the doom loop stories that I've tried to, I've alluded to today, turn out to have much truth to them. And then, of course, as I want to end here on my own doom loop here, an earthquake or two might intervene in the meantime. Okay, thank you.